A secret agent must be solitary and austere. No affections, no ties, no sentimentalities.
Said a man who should know. Richard Sorge, Stalin's master spy in Tokyo. Sorge himself didn't follow those rules at all. He was an eccentric, loved women and alcohol, and was known for his escapades. Perhaps the most ingenious of all disguises. He is considered one of the great masters of his trade.
He was opposed to war and believed that he could help to avoid it by doing his work. He really was one of those people who is highly motivated by his ideology. Sorge is considered to be the master spy of the 20th century, not just by the Soviet Union, but by the USA as well. He must have been a fascinating person. If I had been a woman in his time, I might have hopelessly fallen for him too. Richard Sorge, Stalin's James Bond. The betrayal of a master spy.
What would have happened if Stauffenberg's plot had succeeded, if Pearl Harbor hadn't taken place, and if shortly before that, Richard Sorge, a spy with conviction, hadn't fallen into the clutches of the Japanese? At that point in time, Hitler had conquered half of Europe. The Japanese Empire was undertaking a similar march across Asia, their incursions leaving nothing but piles of rubble in their wake. Together, Nazi Germany and Japan want to wipe out the enemy of all humankind, communism, so they joined forces against the Soviet Union. The self-proclaimed master race lines up to stomp out communism once and for all. Operating out of Tokyo, the committed communist Sorge completes his mission and betrays the German Reich to the Soviet Union, one dictator to another. Shortly before his spy ring gets busted, Sorge sends a message that proves decisive for the further course of the Russian military campaign. The seemingly invincible German armed forces get their first scratches. By the time the tide turns in favor of the Soviets, Sorge's era had already come to an end.
Dr. Sorge, 逮捕状だ.
The man whose mission it was to avoid war is charged with violating the law to protect the peace. In a cynical double cross of betrayal, Sorge is the one who is ultimately betrayed. At the crucial moment, the later hero of the Soviet Union is disowned by both friend and foe alike. The ultimate anti-hero, he allows his life's work to be documented while in Japanese custody. It is both bitter and tragic that world history is not the only thing that could have been very different.
If I had lived under peaceful social conditions and been surrounded by peaceful political developments, I might have become a scientist. In any case, certainly not a spy.
Richard Sorge, the spy that didn't want to be one, was born in Baku in 1895. His mother was Russian, his father German, two peoples that would define Sorge's life. Wilhelm Sorge works as an engineer for oil drilling machines in Azerbaijan, part of the Tsar's empire at the time. The family occupies a villa on the Caspian Sea. Richard Sorge is no child of the proletariat. At the age of 3, his family moves to Berlin. In prison, he described his childhood like this.
Until the war broke out, I enjoyed the relative security commonly found among the prosperous German bourgeoisie.
With the outbreak of the war, the 18-year-old Sorge immediately registers himself as a volunteer to fight for his fatherland. The young man's exuberance dissipates when faced with the carnage on the battlefields of Flanders. He is wounded multiple times. In the end, his left leg is shredded by shrapnel, and he barely avoids an amputation. Sorge is left with a lifelong limp, an Iron Cross second class, and the conviction that such a slaughter must never be repeated.
This wild, bloody brawl shook me to my core. How pointless are these endlessly repeating wars?
Convinced of the peacemaking power of communism, the young man devotes himself to the ideas of Marx and Engels. Sorge takes part in the Kiel Mutiny in 1918 and is active as an anti-capitalist agitator amongst the miners in Aachen. In 1919, he receives his PhD in political science and joins the German Communist Party. The new decade turns Berlin into the most sinful metropolis in Europe. The prudish imperial age is over. The roaring 20s usher in passion and vice, and a new era in art and fashion. No one has yet noticed that the humiliation of the lost war is gnawing at the foundations of the decade. The spirit of optimism hasn't captured everyone. Inflation is eating away at everything, including trust in democracy. The lines of social division are becoming ever more apparent.
The World War from 1914 to 1918 influenced my life from the ground up. Even if other considerations had not played a role, that war alone would have made me a communist.
While in Frankfurt, Sorge comes into contact with senior officials of the Communist International. They invite him to collaborate with them in their Moscow headquarters. Sorge does his job well. He is accepted into the CPSU and dispatched to other European countries. He draws the attention of the Soviet military intelligence services. General Jan Bersin, leader of the 4th Division, recruits Sorge for his network of agents in China. Before Sorge begins his journey, he meets the young acting student Katya Maximova. It is one of many romances, but for him, the most significant one. In Berlin, Sorge acquires 2 publishers who offer to use their status as legal employers to disguise him as a German journalist. In China, Sorge's new area of operation as an agent, 2 civil war parties are fighting over control of the country. The Russians and the Americans provide their minions with assistance in an attempt to secure their respective influence in the Middle Kingdom. On January 10, 1930, the German journalist Richard Sorge arrives in Shanghai. The city is known as the Paris of the East, the New York of the West, a metropolis with cosmopolitan character, a synonym for sin, adventure, and wealth. In 1930, Shanghai boasts the highest skyscrapers in Asia. They belong to merchants and industrial companies. It is no coincidence that China's Communist Party is taking root here and announcing its fight against foreign imperialists. Under the codename Ramsay, Sorge begins to build a network of communist agents. In this city of over 1 million people, this jungle, flickering with chaotic rumors and secrets, anyone looking for a conspiratorial place in which people betray top-secret information and are in constant fear of being betrayed themselves would do well to turn up at the Peace Hotel. It was here that Richard Sorge met the American journalist and Comintern agent Agnes Smedley, a well-known expert on China.
He built up his contacts on the one hand through Russian communists who are already residing in China, on the other hand through communists like Agnes Smedley, who is closely linked to the Chinese communists at that time, and who turns to Sorge and thus changes employers, so to speak. She no longer works solely for the Chinese, she now also works for the Soviet Union.
Agnes Smedley introduces Sorge to the Japanese newspaper correspondent and expert on Japanese China policy, Okazi Hosumi. He is a convinced communist and an opponent of Japanese delusions of grandeur in Asia. On September 31st, Japan attacks and annexes the enormous Chinese province, Manchuria. The proclamation of the satellite state Manchukuo and a bloodbath among the civilian population in Shanghai are only the earliest signs of the Japanese becoming drunk with power and wanting to first subjugate their historical enemy China and then the whole of the Far East.
I felt compelled to dive into the problem of Japan as a whole, and I decided to prepare myself generally as long as I was in China to thoroughly familiarize myself with Japanese history and Japan's diplomatic traditions and practices.
Sorge and Osaki regularly met on Nanjing Road, one of the largest shopping streets in the world at the time. Osaki would unpack his knowledge about Japanese intentions in China. Sorge informs headquarters in Moscow. They are impressed. The effects of the global economic crisis are less stark in Asia than in the West. The hardships of the 1930s paved the way for National Socialism. The NSDAP takes power in the German Reich in 1933, and the new Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler outlines the goals of his policies: to conquer new living space in the East and to ruthlessly Germanize it. The next great catastrophe looms.
Stalin was very interested in having spies in Japan because the Japanese military made it very clear that the Soviet Union was enemy number one.
People are alarmed in Moscow. After so easily conquering Manchuria, the Japanese military might start craving more. And at this critical point in time, Russian military intelligence doesn't have any spy network in Japan.
In Japan, there was an extremely strong defense against spies. They never let the workers at the Soviet embassy out of their sight. The whole Russian colony was under constant surveillance. We needed information, and we needed it immediately. The only way out was to fall back on foreign agents that one didn't have to train. But Stalin did not trust foreigners.
Nevertheless, the foreigner Sorge received orders to build a spy ring in Tokyo. He is charged with scouting out both Japan's military strength and if they plan to attack the Soviet Union.
At this time, Japan is the main source of information. You have to know what Japan wants, because Japan is the defining power in East Asia.
Before his departure, Sorge convinces his lover, Katya Maximova, to marry him. She would be better off as the wife of an officer of the Red Army. It is a decision that Katya will later regret. In order to avoid the strictly controlled route to the Far East, Richard Sorge travels through the U.S. on his way to Asia. He meets up with members of the American Comintern in New York. 8 years later, the connection to Japanese communists in the USA will, almost by accident, tip off the Japanese secret police to the existence of the spy ring. On September 6, 1933, Sorge arrives in Yokohama. Japan has a long tradition of imitating Western countries. Law, army, industrial goods, all copied, especially from Germany. And yet the transition into modern times has not yet fully materialized, and Japanese society is divided, even in the highest centers of power. The emperor, who himself rejects militarism, is threatening to become a compliant tool in the hands of a confident military, one that is vehemently propagating war against Russia. Stalin needs spies who can deliver reliable reports about the course being charted by Japan. The routes used by his messengers, bringing secret files over Shanghai or Hong Kong to Moscow, is threatened by the Second Sino-Japanese War. Radio transmissions are thus becoming ever more important.
Things became difficult in 1940-41 when the colleagues in the Soviet embassy in Japan came into direct contact with Sorge. It was an inconceivable violation of the basic principles of conspiracy, because of course they were under observation.
Sorge operates brazenly. He builds a roughly 40-person spy ring directly under the noses of the Japanese secret police and infiltrates not only the inner circles of Japanese politicians and soldiers, but also of the German elite.
I thought that I would appear more reliable in the eyes of the Japanese if I won the trust of the embassy, and that the embassy would serve as a bulwark against any doubts about my person.
Richard Sorge begins to conquer the German embassy and its surroundings. Soon, he is a known figure in the German colony, one that readily enjoys the back-home flair of the German establishment. Even today, the Imperial Hotel is an ideal place for more discreet meetings.
It is the bar of the Imperial Hotel in the immediate vicinity of the Imperial Palace, and it was the central meeting place for both the German community and others. In the end, the information that Sorge became so famous for procuring certainly came from German sources, but especially from government sources. It is actually an international meeting place. The various media representatives from around the globe meet there. Diplomats, business leaders, business representatives. It was the kind of place where you could gather relevant information, engage in harmless conversation, background talks.
Comrade Branko Vukelic is responsible for transferring secret materials onto microfilm. As it came to light after Sorge's unmasking that his network extended to the very highest levels of the government, people began asking how a European was able to dive so deeply into the seemingly impermeable Japanese society. Sorge has made himself into an expert on his host country, and he counts on Japanese accomplices. The artist Miyagi Yotoku is recruited in the US, and Ozaki Hotsumi, whom Sorge knows from Shanghai, is immediately ready to cooperate. In the following years, Sorge and Ozaki meet at different locations, seldom at Ozaki's home, out of caution. Often in changing places in Tokyo, on street corners or in restaurants, the two exchange news and discuss assignments together.
Sorge's intellectual efforts were adding to his prestige. Ambassador Ott valued Sorge's analysis of Japan very highly. He had even commissioned Sorge to write reports that he was supposed to have authored himself. Intellectually, Sorge was moving on a very high level, Ozaki as well. He came from a top university, belonged to the elite, spoke good Chinese, was an expert in Chinese politics, and could precisely assess developments. What set their spy ring apart from others was that they themselves could submit political suggestions to Stalin.
Sorge's political essays establish his reputation in Germany as an expert on Asia and a serious journalist. His inclusion in the NSDAP completes his perfect disguise. He had laid the foundation for his work. The German officers and officials in Tokyo trust Sorge and his expertise. First and foremost, the military attaché and later ambassador Eugen Ott.
Without this knowledge, I mean my thorough research, no one working at the embassy would have been interested in speaking with me about things or asking my advice on confidential matters.
Richard Sorge is always welcome at social events and gains a reputation as an eccentric, hard-drinking ladies' man. Erwin Wickert was a broadcasting attaché in Tokyo at the time.
Sorge was a very attractive man. Once he was dancing very intensively with my mother at a ball, so much so that my father went over and said, "Come on now, that's enough." He always had the feeling that Sorge was a person who had a very difficult time controlling himself. But sober, he must have been a pleasant guest, who obviously had quite an effect on women.
An eternal stranger who condemns himself to never finding true peace.
Sorge's own words and an expression of his deep loneliness. Under the weight of secrets that he can share with no one, Sorge begins drinking, often without restraint.
When he was drunk, Richard Sorge would curse incredibly about the Nazis and Hitler. And my father would rent a room for Richard Sorge in the hotel in which my father also lived, so that he could sleep there and didn't have to ride home on his motorcycle.
Again and again, Sorge rides his motorcycle in a drunken stupor until he ends up against a wall with a broken skull. When he is released from the hospital, the Otts take extra care of him. The love affair between Sorge and Ott's wife, Helma, seems almost inevitable.
Sorge was a university assistant in Aachen. His professor there was married to a very young woman who Sorge stole away from him. She divorced her husband, married Sorge, and went with him to Moscow. But even after Sorge married the wife of his professor, the two worked together amicably. Strange, right? He even slept with Ambassador Ott's wife. It wasn't a nice story, but it is astounding that Ott also continued working with Sorge.
The marriage to Katya did not prevent other adventures. If the affair with the ambassador's wife really took place remains disputed. It could have cost Sorge his own neck, and his best information source, Eugen Ott, as well.
The relationship between Sorge and Ott is difficult to describe. From the literature, we can gather that they were very close acquaintances, if not outright friends, but nonetheless not without mistrust. But the mistrust was not so much related to the personal relationship between Sorge and the ambassador's wife, but rather regarding the question of if Sorge isn't a bit too thoughtless when he has had too much to drink, shares too much of the personal information that he has with Ott.
In May 1935, Sorge is called back to Moscow. A number of his fellow spies have disappeared, including his mentor, General Berzin. His successors, General Zuritsky and Artuzov, also failed to survive their appointments.
Operations against spies with a foreign background began in 1936. Poles, Latvians, Lithuanians, Finns, representatives of practically all of the Soviet member states were either harassed, ordered back, stuck in camps, or shot. You could say that Stalin destroyed his secret service. In fact, he annihilated it.
No one in Moscow feels safe in the face of Stalin's whims, especially not Richard Sorge with his German passport. He will never see Moscow again, nor his wife Katya. But Sorge remains true to Stalin to the end. Is he turning a blind eye?
Sorge was more of an ideological communist than a party member, and held the view that Stalin was still a lesser evil compared to the Nazis. Given world events, he definitely thought that the fall of Nazi Germany was the most important thing, and that as long as the Soviet Union was standing together with the US, France, and England against the Nazis, he could contribute to bringing about the quickest end to the war by continuing to provide information to the Soviet Union.
Sorge's signalman, Max Clausen, first achieved exactly that at the beginning of 1936 through radio transmission. But the work is dangerous. The Japanese listening posts can receive the illicit signals, even if they can't locate them precisely. Soon, they are certain that a spy is operating out of Tokyo. Risking their lives, agents from around the world are sending secrets to Moscow. Only some of these actually reach the apex of the Kremlin, because whatever seemed unimportant would simply be thrown out.
On top of that, Stalin didn't want any analysis, just pure raw information. He said, "Give me the information and I'll draw my own conclusions."
Sorge's article, Revolt in Tokyo, about the failed military coup in 1936 is one of the most read internationally. His brilliant analysis of the events finally opened all of the doors of the embassy to him. He even gets his own office there. Shortly after the coup, the military attaché Ott asks Dr. Sorge for help.
I had to swear to him that I would tell no one. I did that and helped him to encrypt the telegram in his apartment. Ott had asked me for help and not a member of the embassy because the matter required the utmost secrecy.
My father actually described Ott as a rather reserved ambassador. And even when he knew Sorge very well, my father always assumed that he was obviously not very affable. And also, he didn't know where Sorge was getting his information.
Sorge not only finds out the secret code of the communication traffic with Berlin, but also the details of top-secret German-Japanese negotiations. When the anti-comm intern pact between Germany and Japan is signed in November of '36, Stalin is very well informed. The pact is aimed against the Soviet Union.
From the nearly 700 reports that Sorge had sent, more than half were actually presented to the leadership, including Stalin. These reports were assessed as especially valuable. That speaks to the fact that Sorge was an exceptional spy. I believe it is a unique case in the history of the secret services.
The Japanese continue with their raid in northern China. But the Chinese fight back, and the Japanese continually ask for more help from the China expert, Ozaki Hotsumi. The Japanese Prime Minister, Konoe, takes on Ozaki as a governmental advisor. Sorge's spy ring has penetrated the center of Japanese power. It is a critical moment for the Russians, as their own man, General Yushkov, defects to the Japanese out of fear of Stalin. They are about to extend the border of the state of Manchukuo to the north. Near Nomonhan, they face off against the Red Army, about which they now hold valuable information in their hands. Sorge receives the urgent order from Moscow to make copies of the documents that the deserter has handed over. What does the enemy know about the Red Army? Sorge's report proves invaluable. The Russians change their troop formations and gain the upper hand against a confused Japanese force. Shocked by the loss of more than 8,000 men, the empire must reconsider its goal of expanding into the Soviet Union. From secret documents, it emerges that Berlin is trying to make use of the rethinking process. The German diplomats in Tokyo are instructed to prepare the way for a military alliance with Japan. Hitler is planning a war against England and France and wants to obligate Japan to attack the British colonies in the Far East. But Japan is caught up in its war against China and doesn't want to become involved. Germany responds with anger and signs a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. For the Japanese, this smells like betrayal.
Japan had always hoped that Germany would take Japan's side in a war against the Soviet Union as a matter of principle. But with the non-aggression pact, that was not possible. In the end, the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 had lost its meaning, because the potential enemy was no longer the Soviet Union, at least if international agreements were to be taken seriously. Thus, it also represented an opportunity for Japan to sign a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union in 1941, and the war took a different course than had originally been planned, at least by the strategists.
In order to stop Japan's advance in Asia, the U.S. cancels its trade agreement with Japan, thereby substantially shutting off the oil tap for the Japanese in the West. War breaks out in Europe as the German armed forces march into Poland and begin an unprecedented war of conquest. It only stands to reason that Japan will now form an alliance with the victorious Germans. Ribbentrop sends Special Envoy Stamer to Tokyo for talks with Foreign Minister Matsuoka. During the negotiations, Sorge maintains close relations with Stamer. He has recently become the press attaché, appointed by Ambassador Ott, seen here in a celebratory mood. Long before the signing of the Tripartite Pact, Stalin learns that Japan has joined the Rome-Berlin axis. The alliance intends to direct itself against England and to deter the Americans from entering the war. The nerve-wracking work of spying takes its toll. Signalman Clausen suffers a heart attack and is no longer fully in the game. Important reports are left unsent. Sorge asks once again, after 11 years, to be called back.
There are a lot of examples where these people, when they have worked for the other side for years, for example, I'm thinking about the members of the Cambridge Five who became severe alcoholics because they simply couldn't deal with the pressure. The uncertainty and the pressure, and always having to think about what you talk about with whom, and having to hide things even from those closest to you. Many people can't deal with that pressure over time.
Sorge's request comes at a bad time because the spy ring is entering a decisive phase at the end of 1940. On December 18th, Hitler signs the Commissar Order in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. A mere 10 days later, Sorge can radio a warning to Moscow.
Germans are gathering at the eastern border, including Romania, 80 divisions. Germany is in a position to occupy areas of the USSR along the lines of Kharkov, Moscow, and Leningrad. Ramsey.
Meanwhile, Ribbentrop had changed his strategic priorities. He is no longer looking for Japan's support against England, but rather to have the Japanese take control of the Soviet Union in the Far East. A directive from Moscow arrives in Tokyo. Agents are to deliver a detailed report on the positions of the Japanese troops, from the number and position of the divisions down to the names of the commanders. No problem for Sorge's Japanese spies. On March 3, 1941, Foreign Minister Matsuoka travels to Berlin, Rome, and Moscow. He surprises the Germans by signing a neutrality agreement with the Soviets. Stalin evidently firmly believes in the pact with Hitler and that Japan will ultimately attack to the south. At the beginning of May 1941, Sorge elicits more information from Moscow from a special envoy. German generals are making very low estimates of the Red Army's combat strength. They believe they can eliminate the Red Army within a matter of weeks. Stalin views Hitler's word as beyond question. His mistrust is directed far more at his spies in Tokyo.
Precisely because Sorge was sending that kind of precarious and important information to Moscow, Stalin began to suspect that Sorge might be a double agent. From the way that Sorge was, I can hardly imagine that he was a double agent. I mean, when he was drunk, he spoke belligerently about Hitler and the Nazis. He rejected them completely. Given that, I can't imagine it, but I don't know for certain.
Doubts about Sorge's loyalty are also springing up in Berlin. Vague references to his past in the KPD raise alarming questions. Is Sorge a spy, a double agent, or even a triple agent? Colonel Meisinger is sent to Tokyo as a police attaché to investigate. Does Sorge sense the threat? The newcomer feels very much like a foreigner in Tokyo. Sorge offers himself as a drinking buddy. Meisinger is thankful and becomes dazzled by Sorge's excellent reputation at the embassy and his personal charm. The surveillance of Sorge is withdrawn. And in the embassy, no one doubts his absolute trustworthiness. He freely comes and goes, and has or manages to gain access to Hitler's biggest secrets. Berlin informs Ott that the German attack will begin in second half of June. Attack will take place along the front, main thrust against Moscow and Leningrad, Ramsey. Moscow receives Sorge's dramatic warning on June 20th. The war is about to begin.
The information was only as good as it was useful, and the Soviet intelligence agencies were very, very weak in this sense, because they performed almost no analysis. Instead, the information was simply reported directly to the top.
Stalin receives corroborating reports from other spies, but he does not believe that Hitler will open a war on two fronts and disregards all of the warnings.
Stalin had written a comment on a telegram with a green pen, which was presented to Harnack and Schulze-Boysen on June 21, 1941. To hell with that. It's English disinformation. He believed that it was targeted disinformation from British intelligence aimed at propelling Germany and the Soviet Union into war. Yes, in this case, Stalin actually called Sorge an asshole.
At the crack of dawn on June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed the border into the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa has begun. The soldiers of the Red Army are virtually thrown out of their beds.
June 22nd affected Sorge deeply. According to all the stories, prison records, and the memories of agents Clausen and Miyagi, Sorge ran himself ragged on June 22nd. He binge drank the entire day.
His bitterness over not being taken seriously in Moscow is accompanied by increasing delusions of grandeur.
If anyone annihilates Hitler, then it's me, Richard Sorge.
He evidently claimed in a drunken state, according to comments later gathered from a German girlfriend. And yet, what would have happened if Stalin had believed his spy? The Soviet Union now had to worry that Japan would open a second front in the Far East in order to make use of the German victory in the West. Sorge, report on the behavior of the Japanese government regarding the German war against the Soviet Union. Ott is attempting to push Japan into war against the Soviet Union, according to military sources, possible within 1 or 2 months. Stalin's appreciation for Sorge has grown since June 22nd, but now Sorge feels like he is failing. Japan's true intentions are unclear. An attack on Siberia can neither be ruled out nor predicted with certainty. The German armed forces are advancing into Russia, bringing the Red Army into distress. They need reinforcements from the Far East, but that would turn Siberia into a sitting duck. And then the master spy pulled off perhaps his biggest coup. After a secret meeting, which the emperor also attended, the salvific details seep out through Osaki, and Sorge immediately conveys them to Moscow. Japan will not attack the Soviet Union in the east. Stalin immediately shifts 34 well-rested divisions from the Far East to the west and is able to stop the German armed forces as they rush ahead to Moscow. Sorge considers his mission in Japan to be over. He wants to leave the country, but where will he go?
Sorge had thought about returning to Moscow, but a person as clever as him would certainly not assume that Moscow would be safe for him. He had surely considered the possibility that he would be arrested and killed in Moscow. Even in Japan, he would most likely be arrested. He could have also returned to Nazi Germany, but there would have been a high risk of being arrested by the Gestapo. Exile in the US would have also been a possibility, but as a communist, immigrating to the US would have meant having to renounce his entire life.
As Ozaki provides Sorge with further details of secret talks between the Japanese and the Americans, neither one knows that the edges of their spy network have begun to fray, and that they themselves are now in the crosshairs of Japanese shadows.
There was absolutely no clearly worked out plan for what to do if Sorge were to be arrested. That helps to explain why the entire ring was relatively quickly discovered and arrested in 1941.
Ozaki views the talks between Japan and the US as destined to fail because Japan will hold on to its policy of expansion. Sorge composes a dispatch in which he prophesizes the imminent war between Japan and the US. The message no longer reaches Moscow. It was likely an unimportant, low-level spy, a Japanese communist that had returned from the US who revealed Miyagi's name in order to save his own skin. As a result, the whole ring was busted. On October 15, 1941, Ozaki Hatsumi is arrested.
Ozaki Hatsumi スパイ容疑で逮捕する。
何があったんですか？
Clausen, Vukulich, and Sorge meet on October 17th. They are unable to reach Ozaki. Richard Sorge has been plagued by premonitions for quite some time. He felt abandoned by Moscow and knew that they were all playing with fire and could not remain undiscovered forever. We don't know when he came home that night, but on the following morning he was arrested by investigating magistrate Yoshikawa.
Dr. Sorge, 逮捕状だ。
Shortly before his arrest, he believed he had accomplished his mission in Tokyo. He had reported the most important things. the German attack on the Soviet Union, and that the Japanese would not attack the Soviet Union. And he had asked to be recalled because the last decade in which he had been a spy was so stressful that he simply needed peace and quiet.
This dangerous document, the request to be recalled after fulfilling his mission, remains laying on Sorge's desk. Sorge is transferred to the remand prison Sugamo. For Ambassador Ott, it is a case of Japanese spy hysteria. Members of the embassy and public authorities agree that the suspicion lodged against Sorge is far-fetched. There is suspicion that it is actually a case of political revenge or intrigue. Ott.
When Sorge and Ozaki were arrested, the German government protested, or rather the German embassy in Japan, asking how a trustworthy National Socialist like Sorge could be arrested.
Japan could not afford to insult its Axis partner, especially not now, when the conflict with the US appeared to be unavoidable. In spite of continuing efforts, the Foreign Ministry has thus far not presented any evidence of guilt against Sorge and Clausen. Ott. 1 week after his arrest, Richard Sorge admits to being a communist spy.
Meisinger and Ott were coming under serious fire. They believed until the end that Sorge was their friend.
On December 5, 1941, the Red Army begins a counteroffensive near Moscow. The tables are turning. As he sat in jail, Sorge might have asked himself, what would have happened if I had completed my task of raising awareness about the Japanese-American crisis? Japan uses the oil embargo as a reason to attack the US, drawing them into the war. Sorge's prophecy came true on December 7th. Ribbentrop requested Sorge's extradition. The Japanese refuse. The war has turned, and Sorge could serve as a valuable bargaining chip in negotiations with Moscow. After 5 months of interrogation, the police officer Ohashi presents his final report to the state prosecutor. Sorge addresses him with personal remarks and thanks him.
For the thorough and extremely friendly review of my case, I will never forget how friendly you were to me in the most difficult time of my eventful life.
Ohashi's report recommends the death penalty. Richard Sorge is declared guilty and sentenced to death. He believes that Stalin will arrange for his rescue. If he had known about his wife Katya's life of suffering, he would not have given himself over to this illusion. Stalin's henchmen had arrested her, accused her of being a spy for the German secret services, sentenced her to banishment in Siberia, where she soon died. Her crime was being the wife of Richard Sorge. When the Japanese actually were ready to engage in a spy swap, Moscow claimed, "The name Richard Sorge is unknown to us." Sorge went from being the betrayer to the betrayed.
His contribution was invaluable. No other person had delivered so much information to us about Japan in this intense period. Sorge revealed Japan's situation and problems from A to Z. Fundamental. He was our most valuable worker. When he could no longer deliver, he was treated like a used-up resource. He wasn't interesting anymore. Anyway, it was known that he had talked openly with the investigators. That's why the Soviet government didn't put any effort into saving Sorge.
Ozaki is also sentenced to death and executed. Max Clausen receives life imprisonment. He is freed in 1945. Branko Vukovic receives a life sentence and dies in prison in 1944. Miyagi dies in 1943 during the trial.
Sorge made it clear in his notes that he was as much against Hitler as he was against Stalin, and that as a communist, he assumed that the ideals of socialism and communism, not Stalin as a person, would be fulfilled in the end. After he had set these thoughts down on paper, he was, I think, ready for death.
It remains unclear what the course of the war would have been without the Tokyo warnings. It also remains unclear if and to what extent Sorge became a double agent in the hope of gaining access to even more meaningful Nazi sources. Because he had witnessed hell in the trenches, Sorge, a man who actually never even wanted to be a spy, became Stalin's James Bond.
One of Stalin's greatest mistakes was that he ignored Sorge's information about the German invasion and was therefore not prepared. Sorge was dangerous to him for that reason. He could have brought this mistake to light. Thus, for Stalin, it would have been extremely dangerous to bring Sorge back to Moscow. On the contrary, it was advantageous that the Japanese kept Sorge prisoner and executed him. That's why Stalin didn't take an interest in exchanging spies. When Sorge was executed on November 7, 1944, Stalin was perhaps more pleased than anyone.
On November 7, 1944, disowned by everyone, Sorge goes to his execution.
Long live international communism. Banzai.
His last words defiantly repeat his unbroken faith. November 5th, 1964. Richard Sorge, honored as a hero of the Soviet Union.